a French perspective. If you look at American international relations textbooks for the last 50 years, there's hardly a chapter on the international economy. And the nation has been preoccupied with a variety of issues, diplomacy to be sure, but certainly national security affairs. And interesting are the transformation of the security problems. International economics has become a central concern for all of us globally. Not only does it affect a change in political power around the world, it's just redistribution, but it also has created a series of problems for all of the economies of the world. So both international stability, the balances of power, as well as the well-being of most of the world's population are certainly related to the global economy, which, as we all know, is experiencing some serious problems today and has been for a couple of years. So what was once a dismal science is now vibrant and at the center of our attention and of extraordinary importance to all of us. So we couldn't be any happier with the theme which the ambassador has chosen to address tonight, and the French point of view is of interest to all Americans at all times. The ambassador has been a member of the Foreign Service since 1977. He holds a degree in law. He was educated both in the Institute of Political Studies, where he was a graduate, and is also a graduate of the National School of Administration in France. His career within the Foreign Service has a lot of wonderful beginnings, being posted to London and serving elsewhere. But let me just note a couple of things. His experience in European affairs, of course, was especially deep. He has served as a second counselor early on in the France's delegation to the European communities. He has later served as a chief of staff to the Minister for European Affairs and has himself been responsible for European affairs, and finally was appointed as ambassador to the European Union. He has had a variety of other assignments within government which are impressive. He was Director General of Cultural, Scientific, and Technical Affairs, as well as having earlier held a number of positions within that department. And of course, he was then most recently Chief of Staff to the Minister of Foreign Affairs before becoming ambassador to the United States in 2007. It's always a wonderful pleasure to welcome an ambassador of France here. We've always enjoyed their presentations. It's my great pleasure to present to you Ambassador Pierre Vimont.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. President, for your very kind words. Every time I hear about my bio, I feel very much older. But thanks to the beautiful view we have in front of us, I can live with it, I suppose. And let me tell you, all of you, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, how pleased and honored I am to be here in this city of Baltimore. It's always a great pleasure to come here, and it's certainly a great honor to be here in front of a beautiful audience tonight to talk about the world economy. I'll try to be as brief as possible in what I think should be preliminary remarks, most of all, in order to allow you all the time possible for a Q&A session, if you wish so. But I'm sure this is always the best part of a session like ours. It's the most lively part, the one when you can try to get from the speaker the most honest and candid answers as possible. But beware, I'm a diplomat, you know, I have to be cautious. So. My intention tonight is to forward to you a rather brief message, a rather simple one. It goes in two parts. The first one, I think, is the crisis that I've been going through is to a large extent an illustration of the world, the global world we're living today. And I think as we go on and try to understand in the best way possible what has happened and what is happening at the moment, this idea of a global world that we all have heard about but haven't really quite often haven't really put the finger of the reality of that global world, I think this crisis has shown us in a very simple way what it is about. And facing the challenge of this economic and financial crisis, my second message, I think, would be simply to say that the partnership that the Europeans have with your country, this very old transatlantic partnership and transatlantic alliance, has today a clear window of opportunity to show that together maybe we could bring some of the answers to the difficulties we're facing today. But we have to be very much aware that this is a small window of opportunity, and we shouldn't take too much time in trying to size it and to size this opportunity and to be able to come out with some good ideas and some creativity and imagination. Let me go back to the first point. The idea that this crisis is a perfect illustration of the nature of the global nature of the economy and more largely the world we're living in at the moment. First of all, let me give you just 2 or 3 features of what happened and you will understand perfectly well. First of all, if we look at the way the crisis started, it started in your country to a large extent because of the subprime crisis, but to see how quickly it extended to the rest of the world, the way it expanded first in Europe and then all over the place in Asia and other parts of the world, gives a better idea of the kind of world we're living in at the moment. We have to be aware that at one point during the end of September, it brought not only the financial sector near the brink of a total collapse, but also the whole economic activity. You can detect at one point, at the end of September, if you look at the statistics, how nearly the whole world trade stopped at one point, because nobody was sure anymore how they could finance their exports and imports. And this went through from your country to Europe to China to Singapore, all over the place. And that went very quickly because we're living in a world where technology today allows messages, information to spread rapidly all over the world and to bring everybody to the same level of information and therefore more or less to the same nature and the same level of reaction that we have. So there we were, caught very quickly, much more quickly, for instance, than what may have happened in the 1929 crisis, brought very quickly with a crisis that immediately had some reaction and immediately brought us very quickly on the verge of a total collapse. Now, the second and most positive point is I think we reacted just as quickly, all nations, all of us, in a way, in a coordinating way, that, if we take once again the 1929 crisis, has never really existed before. Here again, 1 or 2 items, elements of information or of reflection on my behalf. The first one, and I think we haven't underlined that maybe enough, is that the central banks, the ones who are in charge of our monetary policy, and of, as far as possible, the surveillance also of our financial sector, the central banks all over the world reacted in a very efficient and positive way. And this is something that has to be remembered. They coordinated very quickly the way they should react. They even invented some new instruments of cooperation, collaboration that they didn't have before. They acted with a lot of courage, and they acted very decisively with very strong determination and a rather ambitious and bold manner of reacting to events. And I think this has been very helpful because looking at the way the central banks reacted brought immediately also a much more positive, constructive and cooperative action by the different governments of the different nations. It went on rather quickly also. Don't forget that the crisis started in mid-September, and by the end of November, President Bush, he was then still in power, managed to gather all the major economic nations of the world in a G20 meeting. I'll come back later on the G20 meeting. But to remember that in September, when President Sarkozy from France came out with the idea that we should try to meet all together to try to find a way through this crisis, his proposal was met with a lot of reservation from many of the other nations. But as time went by, as we took a better awareness of the importance of the crisis we were going through, suddenly the whole thing became to focus and to become more obvious to all of us, and we were able to act together at the international level. But you have to be aware also that our different nations managed to work also rather well together on the bilateral level, on the regional level. Take, for instance, the European nations that were able rather quickly to decide on the kind of measures they should take, all of them at that time, and that we manage also at the international level, as I was saying a few minutes ago, and that was the G20 meeting, which was to a large extent something rather new. Usually the G20 meeting met at the level of the financial ministers or the finance experts. It had never had so far a meeting at the level of the heads of state and governments, and this was something totally new. And that's very interesting that in the middle of that crisis we were able to come out with such an instrument, with such a new idea as quickly as possible. You have to be aware also, just as I was saying a few minutes ago about the central banks, that the governments of our different nations were rather ambitious in what they decided. It was about, first of all, the kind of support, financial support we could give to the financial sector, and that was done in a rather quick way and in a rather bold way also. But it was also a lot to do with the stimulus plan that we set up in most of our countries that have more or less been of the same amount, and that were decisions taken once again rather quickly, facing a crisis that we all thought was of a very dangerous nature. So I think that what one can say, if you compare the crisis of the last century and this crisis, is that it was a crisis of a global nature that took us all a little bit by surprise, and they had immediately a tremendous impact, an outstanding impact on all of our countries. But to say also in this positive way that I'm trying to put forward, that we were able to react in a rather constructive and interesting and creative way that was maybe not thought possible a few months before the crisis erupted. Now, of course, the third element of this illustration is the kind of agenda we're facing today. And coming back to what your president was saying a few moments ago, I think we never had at the international level a working agenda of that magnitude after that crisis. We're still coming out of it slowly, but if you look at the 3 or 4 main chapters of what has been decided by the G20 meetings, the different ones, the one in Washington, the next one that took place in London, and the last one that took place in Pittsburgh, and now we have a program of further meetings next year under the presidency of South Korea. If you look at the different elements of that agenda, the mind boggles to a large extent, because we're trying altogether to look at some of the most important features of our economic situation as it goes on at the moment. First of all, we have to deal with everything that has to do with the reform and the regulation of our financial sector. This has to do with the whole question of the surveillance, an increased and improved surveillance of our financial sector, with creating maybe new agencies, asking our central banks to play a major part into that regulation. But this is, of course, something very important. It has a lot to do also, and you know, and you've heard a lot about it, I won't go into too many details, about the whole question of bonuses and compensation inside our banking sector. But what you have to be aware of is that what we're really looking at is not to try to go against and to try to get involved into many details of what is above anything else the natural mechanism of the financial sector. It has more to do with getting rid of what has been the pro-cyclical effects of those bonuses and compensation that had quite often the implication of increasing the crisis and increasing the imbalances rather than trying to rectify them. And this is really what we're looking at when we're talking about bonuses, stronger regulation with bonuses and compensation. It has also a lot to do with the whole question of the accounting standards all over the world with regard to the banking sector. And fourthly, it has to do also with trying to get under control the practices with some of the offshore sites that exist at the moment. But this is only part of our agenda. And when we're talking about financial regulation, we're only talking about a small part of what we're looking at, because we have also to deal with how to improve the management of the financial institution, the international financial institution, as they're going on today. What has been one of the main features of this crisis we have been through has been the new role played by the emerging countries. You have had for some time those countries like China, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa, and many others that have been longing to be at the table of negotiations when we deal with the major economic problems of our times. But they were not there when we used to meet regularly in the framework of the G8 meeting, which is the instance that has to deal with the economic international matters. China was not there, India was not there, Brazil, Mexico, South Africa was not there, Singapore was not there, and many other countries. I can't mention them all, but you can figure that. In the recent years, we have managed to have those countries being invited only for lunch, quick lunch, and then we were thanking them for coming there and asking them to leave the room. This was becoming more and more ludicrous. And what the financial crisis and the economic crisis we have been through, and still are going through, by the way, has been to suddenly make this whole situation change very rapidly. This has been the setting up of those meetings of the G20 meeting, and of course the countries that are now there at the table, the countries I have just mentioned, they are here to stay, and they want now all of us to take into account the fact that they are there and the fact that now they must have their part to play and their full responsibility. And of course, the consequence of that is that when you look at the other institutions, for instance, the IMF or the World Bank, now those countries want to have their share of the voting, their share of the seats at the board meetings, and this is a discussion that we're going to have to go through in the months ahead that is going to bring a lot of difficulty without any doubt. Just think about the Europeans, which at the moment have a rather large share of the voting and the seats at the table, at the board, on the board of the IMF and the World Bank, and therefore there is going to be there some, I would say, tense and difficult negotiation in the months ahead, but this is, once again, an important feature. A third feature that is going to be very important on our working agenda is, of course, how do we get out? How do we define the way out of this crisis? And of course, it's not about only coming back to the good old days. It's much more important than that. It's defining the proper monetary policies, the proper budgetary policies in each one of our country, and doing that in a coordinating way, so to allow us to come back to some more financial discipline and try slowly to get rid of the very large deficits that we have in more or less in all of our country. If you look at the European countries, for instance, if you look at France, where we're supposed to stick under the ceiling of the 3% of the GDP for our public deficit, we are now high above that limit. France, we are around 8%. Germany is more or less the same. Britain is, even in Britain, is not part of the Eurozone. Britain is nearly 12% at the moment, and it's the same with all the other countries. So we know that we have to find a way back to financial discipline and financial stability. But we have to do it in the proper ways, so not to cut and shorten the and bring to a halt the slow growth that is slowly appearing at the moment, and we have to push in the best way possible. We have to find the proper way between this need for financial discipline again and to try to avoid inflation that could appear in the near future because of the huge amount of money that we have injected in the economy for the last few months. And of course, the fourth feature of this impressive working agenda, once again, is how to find a sustainable growth again. Because we all know that the growth that is slowly moving back into our horizon is a slow growth. It seems to, from what appears in all of our country, that it will be a growth, at least during next year, 2010, a growth that will bring very little employment and that will leave our unemployment rate in most of our country at its present level. This is, of course, very much worrying in a country like France, where we've having a sort of structural unemployment now for many years, with young people having great difficulty to find a first job, and adults around 50, 55 years old having great difficulty in finding jobs for the last 10 years of their professional life. The fact that we were slowly managing to finding answers to that, we had managed to lower our unemployment to a rate of 7 or a little bit under 7%. Now we're back to 10%, just like you. And of course, for the French population, this is bad news. And this is a reason for major worrying, major tension, major social tension once again in our country. But furthermore, and I would like to stress that also, if we want to find a new way of a sustained growth in all our country, that brings about also the responsibilities, the shared responsibility among our nation. Let's be honest, all the world has been so far very much relying on your country to be a sort of rolling the growth all over the world because of your high level of consumption, the fact that you had a very, very low rate of saving, in fact, in your country. Just think about the saving rate in France. On average, 15% of the average income of our household goes on saving in France. This is certainly not the case in this country. But I think after the crisis, your country is going to be slower in regaining this high level of consumption. That means that other nations have to take the lead on that. And we're thinking, of course, about China and some other emerging countries. And it's not sure that so far we have got an agreement among ourselves on who should do what and how this new trend in the world economy is going to go through. And therefore, this is going to be a rather difficult evolution to take as we go along. And this is why we have to be cautious in the way we're going to proceed all together, and each one of us in our different countries. What are the lessons that we can learn from this economic and financial crisis? I would like very quickly to stress 4 of them in order to give you maybe some ideas for your questions, if you wish so. The first one, and a very simple one, and this is another illustration of the global economy we're facing and the global world we're facing, is that not one single country can find alone the solution to the kind of crisis we're facing today. It's not possible anymore because of the global nature of the crisis that we're facing, because the economy of our nations is so much intertwined now all together. You can't find your way out on your own. You can't even find your way out through protectionism if you wish today. That's not the answer, and that would bring your own national economy very quickly to a halt. If we want, as we have shown during the crisis, to find a way through, we need to work all together, and we have to be aware of that. Central banks, different governments of our different nations, the different international institutions, whether they be the IMF, the World Bank, the European Commission, whatever it is, we need all together to work closely, and not one of them can find its way through on its own. It's just like a multi-partnership. I think your president has been using that word more and more. We used to talk about a multipolar world. Sometimes this was not understood. Let's talk about a multiple partnership, because this is really what it is today, and I have to be aware of that. The second point, I think, and we have to be aware of that, is that this global world is a world of great instability to some extent, at least for the time being. And this is a lesson that we have learned with time. When, after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, that appeared a little bit like the success of the Western world, we thought that we had found a world, and we hoped that we had at last found a world of stability without no more division between the East and the West, and that this world would bring about peace, stability, economic growth, prosperity, and this was for the best. What we have discovered in the last 20 years, and that hope may still be retained, and it may still be a hope, but for the time being, it has not been the case. What we have seen is greater divisions among many of our countries, many conflicts appearing here and there. Just think about Iraq, Afghanistan, the difficulties of the peace process in the Middle East, the wars that we had in the 90s in Europe, in the Balkans, the wars that exist today in Africa, whether it be the Darfur, the Great Lakes, the civilian war in Ivory Coast and other places. This has not been a world of stability, and we have to be aware of that, and we have to be cautious about that and to find the way through. Third conclusion or lesson learned, I think, is that we, the Western Alliance, must be aware that our credibility has been somewhat affected by this crisis. We were the countries who used, to some extent, to lecture our partners about what they should do with their economy. We were asking them to put more discipline and more rigor in their banking sector, in their public finances, and that was the way we used to work, through the IMF, through the World Bank. That was the kind of message we were sending to those countries. Now those countries can have some legitimacy and some authority in reminding us that this last economic crisis, which have been of some importance and which is still there, is our responsibility, is our fault. And therefore, Western countries and the Western partnership may have to be a little bit more humble in the way it can act in the next months ahead, and we have to take that on board, because those countries, those emerging countries, are very quick to remind us that we are the ones who have brought the present economic situation where it is today. Fourth lesson learned, I think, and I hinted to that a few minutes ago when I talked about the G20, is in the way we are working at the international level, the way the international community has been used to work. We have to change our working methods, and we have to change our institution. This is already on the way. I was talking about the G20 a few minutes ago, but just think for 1 second about the Security Council in the UN. This is also a place where you don't have, as a permanent member, countries like Germany, Japan, India, Brazil, and all the countries I was talking a few minutes ago. This is becoming very difficult for the Security Council to retain some credibility or legitimacy or even authority when countries of that importance, which are playing such a big political and economic role in today's World's Affairs are not a permanent member of that forum. We have to take that also into account and look more at the way we could improve that situation. But it's not only about our institution. I think it's also more and more about the summits where we try to gather our leaders of all over the world. We have to change the habits of working of those summits. And I remind you, it's a diplomat who is saying that. I've been through many of those summits. We lose time. We come out with some very dull communiques where there is nothing into it. As we go on in a global world that is moving so quickly today, I think our leaders have to be aware that when they gather together, they have to act in a much more efficient, quick way. Time is of the essence. This is something that my own president, President Sarkozy, reminds time and again. Today, time is of the essence in trying to solve all our problems. We can't indulge ourselves in taking our time. You know that diplomats love to let time go by and hope that things will find a solution by themselves. We're living in a world which this is becoming more and more difficult, maybe unfortunately, but that's the way it is. Last point, last message I wanted to give to you, and I'll go as quickly through that as possible. It's the role that the Atlantic Partnership can play in the months ahead. This partnership between the United States and Europe, United States and France, United States and Germany, etc., have fostered since World War II a very strong partnership that was based on a strong set of common values, principles, and convictions, democracy, justice, tolerance, and dialogue. And that was good, and that is still very good. It was, and it is, a partnership that has relied on common institutions. NATO, of course, as the European Union has been growing and increasing and strengthening. We have those summits between the United States and the European Union. We have those new fora that we have created together, the Transatlantic Economic Council, the new Council on Energy, where we try to work together to find solution. And I think this is for the best. And we have, since World War II, got this strong feeling and this strong impression that we were at the center of the decision-making process for the whole international community. And it was right to a large extent. But look what we are today, and let's be cautious. The world is changing, and our transatlantic partnership is evolving. Just two references that are very obvious one. The population. Today, if you add the whole population of this transatlantic partnership, the Americans on one side, the Europeans on the other side, will still represent more or less 1/6 of the total population. In 20, 30 years from now on, it will be only 1/9 of the total population. We will be decreasing. Look at wealth. We today represent 50% of the world GDP. In 20, 30 years from now on, we will only represent 1/3 of the world GDP. So if we just let things go by, our importance, our role, our influence will be on the decreasing pattern. And we have to be aware of that and therefore try to change as long as we can this situation as it is going. We have a window of opportunity there, but it's now. And as I was saying, time is a very important factor, and we shouldn't lose too much time. What should be our objectives? I think it should be to select a few priorities and to work on them as and get a common position that we can present to other partners in the international community, and to try to have those priorities go by. It has a lot to do with the necessary reforms that we have to do in the economic sector, the agenda I was talking about. It's very important for Americans and Europeans to have a common view on that, on the way to get out and the way to find solution to those different features and challenges I listed a few minutes ago on the working agenda that we have. And I think this is certainly the most important priority we're facing at the moment. But there are others. There is the whole debate about the climate change, where Europeans and Americans have to find a common ground to work that through and convince our partners to work with us. And of course, on the political side, there is the whole question of Afghanistan we're going through, and also the Middle East peace process, where I think, once again, Americans and Europeans have to work together if we want to bring more stability in today's world. And of course, we have to work together also on imposing the right working method, what I was talking about institutions or summits or whatever it is. Just let me give you one example. The G20 meetings at the G20 summits. In fact, there are still a lot of small details, and there are not small details, that we have to solve. How many of those summits do we have to attend each year? When we have no summit, should we have the presidency working on its own, or should they have the support of 2 or 3 countries that will work with them? Is the present membership of the G20 the right one? Some countries are missing there that are rather important, and we have been working so far on a very pragmatic basis. But now that the G20 is here to stay and is going to be in some way institutionalized at the summit level, we have to be careful to work it in a proper way in order not to give the impression to some countries that they're left aside. So that's really the challenge we're facing today. And just to end on a more general note, as we try to work together, Europeans and Americans, Americans and Europeans, to try to face those challenges and find solution to that, let's be careful not to send the wrong message. Let's not give the impression that this Atlantic partnership that has been working so well for the last 50 years is not a coalition of the wealthy against the poor, not a coalition of democratic countries that are trying to impose on the others their way and their style of democracy. Let's not try even more to appear as a sort of the coalition of a Christian community against non-Christians, and I'm thinking, of course, about the Muslim. We have to be proud of our values and our convictions. We are democratic countries. We defend Christian values, and we have to be very proud of that. And we are rather prosperous, and this is a tribute to the success of what we have been doing for many years. But what I'm saying is that even if we want to defend those convictions and try to push forward our ideas, let's try to do it with tolerance, with a sense of dialogue towards those countries that for many years have resented the fact that this partnership between your country and the Europeans was ruling a little bit the whole world and the whole international community, and that we have to work this out in a more humbled way and in a way that takes more into account what are the thoughts and the views of our partners in this global world that we're facing today. I stop here. I've been too long. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Well, you certainly haven't been too long, and we thank you very much for a comprehensive structuring of a discussion and your suggestion of priorities and courses of action and the spirit within which we should approach them. So with that wonderful introduction, the floor is open to questions. Yes, sir. The question is, what advantages or disadvantages would there be to shift oil trade from dollars to euros? Did you want to broaden that to other baskets of currencies being considered, or just euros versus dollars? Yes.
That's enough for time being, you're right. You know, we Europeans are quite cautious about the euro. The euro has been a success in the recent years. Don't forget that a few years ago it was very low. And we are quite aware that what we have been trying to do with this Eurozone is still a very delicate balance. Because you have to be aware that in the Eurozone, We have a common monetary policy that is being looked at by our central banks and the European Central Bank. But our economic policies, and for instance our budgetary policies, are still of the competence of each member state. France has been pushing for more coordination, but we're not yet there. We're trying to do that, but it's going on a very gradual, incremental pace. And therefore, one has to be aware that the euro is still on the making. It's still on an ongoing process, ongoing working process. And therefore, the Europeans are not particularly looking for the euro appearing as a sort of international reserve currency. We're not sure that it has today the strength of being something like that. And we're not in the process of a strong competition with the dollar. We think we are more realistic and I would say more responsible about that. And for the oil-producing countries, I don't think you will see them at the moment suddenly rushing away from the dollar. Maybe they will start to be more cautious and to try to mix the currencies, the reserve currencies currency reserves that they have, and try to diversify those reserves. But I think the dollar is still here to stay for a while because of what it represents, the habits that we all have in the financial sector, and the fact that if you look from a realistic point of view of each one of our economies, the American economy is still in the world. It's just a pure statistical fact, is still the more important and prosperous economy in the world. And you still represent more than 23 or 24% of the total world GDP. None of our countries on its own represents something like that.
Does the internationalization of institutions, which you discussed, represent a diminution of France's historical role as a great power?
I suppose we French want to surprise you from time to time, and that's why I was trying to show a humble way of going through. But at the same time, I can reassure you, France still wants to play a big part. I think what we're trying to do is to find the right balance. As I was saying previously, we know certainly, and like every other country, that once again France alone can't find a way out of this of the different challenges we're facing in today's world. We know we have to work with partners, and after all, this is what we've been trying to do since the end of the 1950s, with the European construction, and the way we have been going with a great success, I must say, through the whole process of building this European Union as it has been going on. And we'll still rely very much on our partnership with America, and the fact that France has gone back into the military organization of NATO tells a lot about that. And certainly the present French authorities note that they have to work with the others. But that should not prevent France from saying time to time what it thinks. And where we think we may have a good idea, we will put it on the table and put it in the international institutions and the international fora whenever necessary. Think, for instance, about the Middle East. France has a long tradition of being there. And we think that with countries like Syria, with Lebanon, and with other countries in the area, we have found a way of discussing with them, of trying to bring them to work in a better way with us. And we think we have there maybe some ideas that we can share with our partners. And we will certainly retain that right and that capacity and that ability to voice our concern, first of all, and voice then the solutions that we think could be possible. So you will still have to live with a lot of French creativity and imagination in the years ahead. I don't know if we should rejoice or not, but that's the way it is.
Well, I'd get three questions out of that, but the first was an observation that the WPA was a public works program as opposed to private enterprise stimulated by government monies. And I think that was the intent of the gentleman who asked the question. And then, what was their second one now? Yeah, was compensation of executives as big an issue in France as it was here? And then the third one, yes, is Michael Moore. Have you seen his latest movie?
I maybe start by the end. No, I haven't seen it yet, but I think that has to do with the very heavy agenda that any ambassador has in Washington, D.C. at the moment. But I'd love to see it, and I'm sure I'll find time one day or another to see it. On your observation about the Roosevelt experience, you're absolutely right. But I was trying to enlarge the thinking, because mostly it has to deal with investment, whether you do investment, in fact, in public sector or in private sector. And you're right about that. It was mostly on public sector. And research can be also a lot on public sector, at least in France, where the research is going through a lot of our public agencies. But it was more about, in today's world, should we use the old techniques of renovating infrastructures? Should it be the main thrust of what we try to do, or should we try to be maybe a little more complex in the way we are approaching the reality of the economy today? And I think we have to today, because today our economy is pushed by many different factors, and we have to take all those into account. With regard to bonuses and compensation, that could be a very good illustration, one more, of the global world we're living in. Because if you look at the kind of debate you have had here in your country for the last few months about the economic policy of the government, bonuses and compensation, the financial support to the banking sector, have we done too much or not too much, cash for clunkers, for instance. Exactly at the same time, you had exactly the same debate in France, and exactly the same reaction by public opinion along your line. Outcry at the bonuses and compensation, and this went rather far. The president, our president, came in and said that this was intolerable and we had to stop that immediately. Cash for clunkers also brought a lot of debate, discussion, and uncertainty about whether we should go ahead or not. And in fact, if you look at most of these developed countries, industrialized countries as yours, as Germany, Britain, France, Spain, or Italy, we're going through exactly the same difficulties, more or less at the same time, more or less at the same level. And there is very, very little difference between what's happening in our countries at the moment, even with the political debates that go along with this economic situation. So I find that very impressive, reading my American newspapers in the morning and then getting my French newspapers. It was really the same. So that's interesting, maybe a bit worrying, I don't know. The mind boggles a little bit.
Do you have a prediction on GE and Areva coming together in some kind of an arrangement?
Mm-hmm. Well, this has to deal more generally with the nuclear energy policy in France, which has been a main feature of our economic policy for the last 40 or 50 years. In fact, it's started with General de Gaulle and went on with his successors. Because you have to be aware that this has been very much a public policy, a government policy that was really a decision by our government. It's very interesting. You have to be aware of that. Our Prime Minister reminded me when he was in Washington a few months ago of that, is that on the same day, it was in 1973 or 74, I think, the French government decided for the new generation of our nuclear energy, and at the same time decided about the high-speed train. to major decisions that have been great successes, I think, and that were taken by our government that afterwards put the necessary financing into that. So we have a rather good expertise, of course, on nuclear energy. As you know, nuclear energy represents today 80% of our electricity. And of course, we were forced to do that because we have no oil, we have very poor coal, we had no natural gas, and rather than importing, we had to import, and we still have to import a lot of gas and oil from the outside. We were looking for some energy, national energy, home energy, that will allow us to retain some sort of independence in the energy sector. So we have been rather successful. We're going now to a new generation, and of course we're ready to share that expertise with whoever wants to. And as you may have seen in Europe, there is a trend nowadays to go now back again to nuclear energy in Italy, in Britain. Germany is still somewhat hesitant, but you may have some evolution there in the future. And of course, a lot of other countries, third countries, are also interested. I know that there is a debate here in this country, but we have set up some partnership between Areva NDF and Constellation, between Areva and the non-nuclear side with GE, as you were saying. We are, of course, quite ready to share that expertise and to work, but it is, of course, up to you and to your country and to this present administration in Washington to decide how far they want to go with a new generation of nuclear energy plants. And this is of your competence, not of France.
Comment on Concordia and your affection for Jerry Lewis.
On Concordia, unfortunately, the aircraft became a bit old and was becoming dangerous in terms of security and safety. And you remember that one of the Concorde had a terrible accident in Paris, in Paris Charles de Gaulle, and they decided to stop the flights of. We all regretted that there was not a new generation that could come in. But as you know, the aircraft industry and the airline industry have been going for a huge carriage now. We are going out with this A380 Airbus, who can carry something like 500 passengers. So they're going for that rather for the small, high-speed Concordia. That's the decision they have been taken. With respect to Jerry Lewis, I think it was a question of generation, to be honest. And I was part of that generation and that enjoyed, I apologize, but that's true, to enjoy tremendously Jerry Lewis and thought he was a master in the movie industry. I think the young generation doesn't know much about him anymore. It's unfortunate. And I will try to work in the right direction on that one. But it's true to say that youngsters now are very fond of your movies. They're still very fond of your movies. But not particularly about Jerry Lewis, because he's of another generation, I suppose. Mm.
Well, the two questions. One, do you have a solution to Iraq? And then secondly...
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan, sorry. And are you a partner in that?
We have at the moment around 3,300 soldiers in Afghanistan, working very well with their American counterparts. No caveats, working on the eastern part of eastern border of Afghanistan, with very strong coordination with the American commandment who is there in a joint operation that is called, you can figure that out, Lafayette. Operation Lafayette. So we're there and we intend to remain there and help. One of the reasons why we can't do more is that at the moment we have many other external operations where our soldiers are. 2 or 3 operations in Africa, in Ivory Coast, at the border between Chad and Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. We are also in the Balkans, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo. We are also in South Lebanon under the auspices of the UN. And therefore that brings our total of our soldiers around, it must be between 20 and 30,000, and we don't have enough staff to put more people in Afghanistan, at least for the time being. With respect to Afghanistan, when you were asking me if I had the solution, it is a very complicated solution. We all know that. We all know that the solution can only be political and will not be military. We intend to be good partners and bring our military contribution to our NATO allies and to America, and we are there to stay as long as necessary in order to bring back stability. But we think that if we want to bring back stability, we have to look at the other dimension of that crisis. The whole question of the development and the development assistance we can bring to Afghanistan in fields like agriculture, education, public health. We are all working on our own there. We don't have enough coordination among the international community, and I think we really need to improve our record there if we want to be more efficient, which we are, I think, unfortunately not at the moment. And there is the whole political dimension. We are all putting pressure at the moment, as you have seen, on the newly elected or re-elected President Karzai and his government in order to bring them to be more efficient, to work a better way among themselves, to fight corruption where it exists, to find a better way of working with the different governors in the different provinces around the country, not to give the impression that this government is only working in Kabul and staying in Kabul, confined in the capital but not going outside. And then there is also the whole question of the kind of political dialogue that this Afghan government could start to do and the kind of outreach they could try to do to its opponents, whether they be political opponents, the Mr. Abdullah, who fought against President Karzai and who could be considered a little bit like one of the leaders of the opposition. What kind of responsibility could President Karzai give to him? And maybe even to think about a dialogue with some elements of the Taliban that could be responsive to such an offer of a dialogue with them. We have to find a way through that, because the only way to bring back peace and stability in Afghanistan will be through this political dialogue that is quite necessary, bringing all those different communities inside Afghanistan together. So we're ready to work on that. I think we share those views and have a common analysis with our American counterparts, with our European counterparts. So it's all about how to implement those policies in those different dimensions.
Mr. Ambassador, we thank you very, very much.
Thank you.